This is Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing. I'm Rachel Gordon. Here we aim to make the process of writing and publishing a bit more transparent and a bit less overwhelming. Through conversations with editors and academics at all stages, from full professors to graduate students, independent scholars, and postdocs, we share stories, lessons, and helpful habits from our writing lives. Well, we're delighted today to get to speak with Rachel Cockerell, who is a writer and historian who was raised in London and living currently in New York. Her first book, which has just recently come out in the US, is Melting Point, an experimental history about her family's search for a promised land. And it's gotten a lot of praise all over, including the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Times Literary Supplement, and the Financial Times. So this is a very exciting time. Congratulations, Rachel. I really appreciated how the preface of your book really made clear your thinking about how to write this book. You wrote in that preface that despite being someone who instinctively recoils from books that claim to be experimental, you ended up choosing a pretty non-traditional form for your book. Can you explain this format?
Sure. So the way I sort of explain it is that the whole book is told through primary sources and through primary sources alone. Most nonfiction books do have primary sources. They sort of incorporate quotations from letters and diaries and newspapers, but they sort of weave an authorial voice through those sources, almost like sort of gluing them together, making the transition smooth from one to the next. And I began to wonder whether I could make a smooth transition from snippet to snippet, from one source to the next. Partly because by taking my own voice out, I felt like the reader was just immersed back into that place and time without this sort of 21st century voice reminding them of where they were. And without sort of giving my own opinion, I wanted the reader to sort of form their own opinion about things and not be, pushed in one direction or the other by me. I wanted there to be sort of no comment from me. So yeah, I began sort of weaving all these sources together, and I sort of found that they seemed to just click into place. It was almost as if these voices from 100 years ago were coming back alive and arguing with each other and jostling with each other and saying, no, that's not how it happened this way, sometimes sort of backing each other up. And it was just amazing and lovely to have this sort of chorus of voices telling a story without me sort of butting in.
Did you get any pushback or resistance from your editor about this format, or did they see this too?
My editor was a little reluctant, but that was because originally the book everything was in quotation marks. So it was, a quotation and then said the New York Times or wrote Theodore Herzl. And my editor's suggestion was to remove all those quotation marks, remove all the saids and the wrotes, and just put the names in the margins, almost kind of reminiscent of citations, somewhere between citations and a play. But what it means is that you can sort of glance into the margin and see who's speaking, or you can just ignore it and get sort of carried along by the story. My agent, going back in time, my agent was also, she had her reservations. I sent this book out on submission and she got back to me saying, I'm 10 pages in and I like the style, but I'm not sure if you can sustain this for the whole book, but I'll let you know what I think when I get to the end. And by the end, I had sort of persuaded her, I guess. She got back to me and said, yeah, it worked. And then my sister, who is a journalist and I send all my work to, I think she was the first person to read it. And I sent her the file, this document, and she called me, 6 minutes later saying, there must be some mistake. You've sent me the wrong file. This is just notes. So yeah, funnily enough, there was so much pushback along the way. And yet I always felt so confident in this weird experimental style, even though as you said, in principle, I'm sort of against experimental writing, especially experimental history. But I just felt like it was working, and then it did something, and it had a sort of spark of energy to it. In the face of all the naysayers, I persevered.
So that sounds like even before the agent sent it to editors, you had arrived at this format. And then once it got sent out to editors, did they recognize this worked right away too, or did anyone at that stage try to convince you otherwise?
I think people saw that it worked. I think partly because I was lucky enough to have just a mountain of archive material. So really, there was no need for me to be in this story. the story sort of told itself. All these eyewitnesses from the early 20th century told it without needing me in it. My editor did ask me to write a preface and an afterword just to sort of tell people what they were getting in for, and also to get a sense of who I was as an author. And I guess the book is better now with that, but I did sort of love it when it was just this strange object that sort of taught you how to read it. This is a phrase that George Saunders uses about Lincoln in the Bardo, which my book is inspired by. He said his book has there's no preface saying, get ready for something a bit weird. The reader is just sort of thrown into this world. And I kind of wanted that. But alas, my editor said, afraid not, you're going to have to write a preface.
It's very effective for bringing the readers into the story. In the New Yorker, Catherine Schultz describes it as the thrill of eavesdropping directly on the past. And I wonder, I'm sure many of my academic colleagues will be reading this because many of us write about Israel Zangwill and that whole crew, and you're writing about them in a really exciting way. And so for some of us, when we look at this book, it may look like, gee, wasn't this really easy to just place these primary sources? But I have a feeling it probably took a lot. I don't know if I'd be able to do that, to place them in a way where they can actually tell the story without you narrating. How did you figure out how to place them?
Do you know what? The book was so bad for so long. Draft 1 to 99 was just fairly unreadable. If you can imagine, I had just these endless hundreds of pages of primary source material, and I was trying to cut them down or, select one sentence that I liked or two paragraphs that I liked and just endlessly rearranging them. And it was just repetitive and it didn't make any sense. And there were sort of holes in it, some bits with too much stuff and some bits with no stuff at all. And some bits where, I was missing a certain sort of beat of the story and I knew that I couldn't write it myself. I had to sort of hunt it down. I had to find it somewhere. There was one crucial piece of the story which I only found, after years of putting this book together. So yeah, it was a long process of revising and rearranging and cutting down and restructuring and having this structure sort of swirling around my head at all times. When I woke up in the morning, I thought, I wonder if I just rejigged it a little bit, then maybe it would all work. But there was also this sort of uncanny and quite addictive feeling when things did slot into place, when two quotations were juxtaposed and this phrase I keep coming back to, they created this spark of energy. It sort of came alive in a way. And it was strange because I could feel that happening. It was such a strong feeling that, this is the correct order for these sources to be in, or for these snippets to be in. Once they did start clicking into place, it all happened quite quickly.
How did you keep this list of sources? It sounds like they were in your mind, but were they physically on note cards or on a Google Doc or just document?
On a Google Doc, which originally it ran to about 250 pages, and it started taking so long to load that I made a new one. And when that ran to 250 pages, I made a new one. And I think I ended up with about 10 of these. This story takes place over the first half of the 20th century. And I was doing my research quite haphazardly. I would think, today I'm in the mood to research the part of the story that takes place in 1897. And then the next day I might be in 1921. So the document was a chronological chaos. So I guess the first year or two was just research, and then it was a mixture of research and putting everything together. And I would select things from the document and, sort of drag them over to the book document. I don't know if you use this app called Scrivener. It's kind of an alternative to Microsoft Word, but I kind of couldn't have written my book without it, because it felt like, laying everything out on the floor and rearranging it. It was that sort of feeling of being able to zoom out and sort of see the wood from the trees. So that's sort of, in practical terms, how I did it.
About your sources, to give listeners an idea, how did you find them? You've got articles from newspapers, American newspapers, British newspapers, the Jewish press, and then it seems like some interviews, sort of the transcripts of conversations you had with relatives. Many of us historians are used to using these online databases from libraries. Did you kind of have your terms that you were sticking into that to find these newspaper articles?
I did. I wrote most of this book during the pandemic. So all the archives had shut down, and I was just sort of surfing the web on my couch. And luckily, a lot of the characters in this book are very good sort of keywords. They're very Googleable. The main character, I suppose, is called Israel Zangwill. So I would often type in Zangwill to the Library of Congress's newspaper archive, or there's something called the British Newspaper Archive, and it wasn't like typing in Smith. All the results of Zangwill would be about this particular Zangwill. My great grandfather's surname was Jockelman. Again, just like a dream for digital research. So yeah, I used a lot of online databases, and sometimes I sort of thought I had done them all, and then I would just find a new one. Sometimes, a website made by an amateur historian which had hundreds of thousands of pages of old newspapers. Sometimes, I think I found there's something called New York Historical Newspapers or something along those lines. And I would just keep on finding more and more of these, and, type in Zangwill and get, 4,000 results. So it was bittersweet, because I thought, oh, this is going to take so much longer than I thought. And also that, that a whole host of sort of treasures were awaiting me.
Yeah, they're treasures for the reader too. In your acknowledgments, you mentioned that your parents are documentary filmmakers. I was wondering if that, do you think, influenced your understanding of how to tell the story?
Yeah, I think it did. I mean, everyone tries to sort of rebel from their parents in a way, or sort of do something a bit different. But I realized when I had finished this book that the influence of my parents was on every page, both in terms of their strong opinions about how to tell a story. I grew up, if we were watching TV as a family, they would constantly be commenting, oh, I would have cut just 6 seconds earlier, or, that person should have been cut altogether, or that, talk about narrative arcs and things. But also, I guess this book has sort of echoes of a documentary. I think people do get used to the style of interwoven primary sources quite quickly, because this idea is used so much in TV documentaries. Sometimes, a documentary maker will hire some, voiceover actor, or sometimes they just won't, and they will have no voiceover, and the story will be told by eyewitnesses. And it's, I think there's so much potential for this form in nonfiction writing, which has been sort of fairly untapped so far.
You mentioned, I can't remember if this is in one of the interviews I read with you, that you sort of wanted to move towards or maybe it was in your preface, you wanted to move towards the book being kind of told like a novel, as opposed to just sort of a nonfiction history. Why not stick to the regular nonfiction history?
I spent most of my history lessons at school looking out the window, drawing little cartoons, like wondering what I was going to have for lunch. And, I never really read history books as a teenager and young adult. I kind of thought of history books as something you sort of, out of sense of duty, you maybe dipped into, to learn a few facts and memorize a few dates, and then, snatch the book shut again. And I wanted to create a history, but something which just was as alive and vivid as a novel, and had characters who sort of, led you by the hand through the story, and who you grew affectionate for, or, who sort of came alive off the page. Yeah, I mean, that's my favorite form of history writing, authors like Candace Millard and Eric Larson, who just, it's this old phrase, nonfiction it's more unbelievable than fiction often. You can be more outlandish, because you're not going to have a reader saying, I don't believe that would have happened. That seems a bit unlikely. So many things in this book seem absurd, and yet the joy of nonfiction is that you don't have to sort of convince a reader of its likelihood of happening.
Mm-hmm. A minute ago, we were talking about your parents, and when I was reading it, I was thinking how it could have been part of the story that you talked about your father or other close family members' feelings about this kind of Jewish history that you're kind of now putting in their face or telling all of us about. But I think we don't get any idea of how your parents were reacting to this being reasserted, or I guess as a reader, I was wondering, although it didn't seem like it had to be part of this book, it could be part of a essay you write, for instance, sort of what you felt your father or other relatives felt about this Jewishness that you're describing here, because in some ways the book also shows us how opposite Britishness can seem to the Jewishness. So I wondered, was that ever something you wanted to tell, or did it always seem like that's not part of this book to talk about sort of the family feelings about the Jewishness today?
Yeah, so my family, the book is called Melting Point, and it's about the melting pot of America, and also to some extent the melting pot of England. My great grandfather was a Russian Jew who arrived in England on the eve of World War One with his daughter, his 8-year-old daughter, Fanny Jockelman, my grandmother. And Fanny, a Russian Jewish woman, married an Englishman, and apparently decided to become more English than the English. I never met her, but she died before I was born. But that was apparently her feeling about her own identity, which meant that she did not teach her children her mother tongue of Russian. She didn't cook any sort of Russian or Jewish food. She cooked just horrible English food. As a result, my dad is, I would say, not particularly Jewish. He's a Londoner. He's an English man. So I guess Jewishness I sort of always knew vaguely that I was a quarter Jewish, but it never felt like it was at the core of my identity. So when I started writing this book, I think my parents were quite bemused that I was suddenly, why is she so interested in Judaism all of a sudden? It just never felt like it was part of my family's identity. So yeah, I guess it is part of this book, but I never knew how to put it in the book. It's sort of a bit in the preface and the afterword.
Yeah. One of the things we talked about on this podcast is how our writing is fitting into our career trajectories, or how writing projects come about in our career. So we've heard from other guests who've written trade press books, and sometimes that's a result of having written magazine articles. For you, how did this contract with Macmillan and I guess the relationship with the agent, how did these things come about?
So I finished a master's in journalism and then quickly sort of become a bit obsessed with this story. I graduated in January 2020 and I thought, I'll give this a few months and then I'll go and get a real job. And then suddenly it was March 2020 and this was my real job. I think I finished the book maybe 2 or 3 years after that. And, with nonfiction, obviously, the traditional route is to get an agent and write a proposal and then go on submission to editors with your proposal. But I think because I thought, it's my first book and I sort of believed that I would never finish it. And I was daunted by the idea of having a contract and having to write something and not being able to do it, having to sort of give the money back. So I just finished the book first and then went out on submission with UK agents, had a few offers of representation, and then chose an agent who then sent it to UK publishers. She then sent it to American publishers and didn't have any luck. So when the book came out in the UK, I then reached out to American agents who, some of them thought, how can we publish a book in the US if it's already out in the UK, if people can just sort of ship it over from the UK? But my amazing agent sort of thought, it'll be fine. And she sent it out to American publishers. And that was that. I signed with FSG. So the book came out a year later in America versus in England.
It seems like it must have been a really exciting time since publication. Were you prepared for all this attention? At what point did you realize the book was going to be such a hit and really such a big event in book news, I guess, on both sides of the Atlantic?
I don't know. I think in terms of being prepared for it, I feel like having journalist parents, I feel like I've been in media training all my life. It's all about, telling concise stories at the dinner table and so on. And I guess I've been around, media and, recording equipment and things all my life. So I guess it was quite an easy transition. I do still feel sometimes like I'm a bit of a sort of salesperson for myself that, it's strange. It's a strange thing to, be on your own, writing your little Google Doc for 3 years and then suddenly have to sort of talk about it in a neat and smooth way. But yeah, I guess the thing is that this was all swirling around my head for so long and I was always trying to shoehorn it into conversations with people because it was all I thought about. Also, these characters and this whole story only existed in my head. It almost felt like a sort of figment of my imagination. Zangwill was once the most famous Jewish writer in the world and now no one's heard of him. And to now, years after I started this book, have people say, I loved Israel Zangwill in your book. To have him sort of come alive to other people and the other characters in this book has been kind of a relief in a way to have these characters exist in other people's heads and not just in my head.
Yeah, an academic colleague of mine, Mary Jane Ruckelson, also a friend, she'd read your book and told me how great it was to, she's a Zangwill expert, but to see him come alive through your writing. That what you said reminds me, some writers feel like they don't like to talk out loud about the book they're writing until it's published. But I can't tell from what you're saying if it was actually somewhat helpful. Did you find it helpful to sort of talk it through with people in conversations even before it was published?
I think it was, unless I was just sort of talking about a little, a character or a little anecdote that I'd found, which was fun. I think talking about the book itself before the book exists, for me, and I think for a lot of people, it gives you a bit of imposter syndrome. You're talking about this thing as if it's, a real finished object in the world, and really it's just a document on your laptop. And the nice thing about writing most of this book during the pandemic was that it kind of felt like a secret project for a long time. I don't think I even mentioned it to anyone outside my family for, at least the first year. Or at least, I said, oh, I'm just doing some research about my family. And, now we're starting to sort of research a new book in the post-pandemic world and having people ask me about it, and really I'm at such an early stage that I just have like a horrendously messy sort of Google Doc with lots of hyperlinks. Yeah, it does feel strange and a bit impostery to talk about something before it exists. So yeah, it's nice. I guess it's just nice to sort of keep it a secret for as long as possible.
I did read that this second book you're working on is about Halley's Comet. Was it easier to start on book two, already having a book out there or about to be out there? I don't know when you started, but how do you find it being in working on book two now?
For a while, I was in I think Eric Larson calls it something like the frozen wasteland of no ideas, or the barren wasteland of no ideas, where so a project has taken over your entire brain for so long, and then you're sort of emptied out afterwards. You're empty of ideas, and it felt quite sort of artificial to say, oh, and now I must find an idea for a new book, and sort of leafing through library books, thinking, is my next book here? And that phase lasted for quite a long time. I kind of thought maybe that's it for me. Maybe I'll never find another story which is compelling, at least to me, as this one. I mean, with this story, I felt so lucky with all the things that I uncovered, and this story which seemed to have been not really told before, or not told in the way that I was envisioning it. And I thought, maybe everyone just gets that lucky only once, and that'll be it. I'll have to find something else to do. And then I bumped into a historian called Anna Kay, a British historian, who said that, I said to her, I think I'm done. And she said, no, don't worry. It'll happen. You'll find another idea at some point. She said that with her books, she also writes history, and there were sort of overlapping characters in each one. There were sort of characters who made a cameo in one book who might be the main character in her next book. And I loved that idea. So now I've kind of gone back to a similar time period, and I hope that there will be sort of echoes or hopefully sort of overlaps between the two books.
And how did you know you had hit upon the second topic for a book?
Again, to quote Eric Larson, he says that when when you've found an idea, if it has heart, it's just a strange sort of instinct that you have. There's something there, even if, so far I've only found one character for my new book, which feels a little worrying, especially as Melting Point has so many characters and a lot of sort of main characters. But I just feel that there's something there. There's something at the center of this. And yeah, it's just a nice sort of instinct.
Yeah. There's two questions that we ask all guests, and one of them is whether there is something you wish you had known earlier about writing or publishing.
Oh, I think, to quote someone else, because I clearly just love quotes, quotations, George Saunders, who wrote Lincoln in the Bardo, which is his first and only novel. He's a short story writer, and he kind of thought maybe I don't have it in me to write a novel, but he imagined Lincoln in the Bardo as, his short stories were like building yurts, and he imagined that a novel would be like building, a mansion or a palace. And actually, for him, he just built a lot of small yurts and connected them together. And I felt the same way, or at least I wish I had told myself that even with a, 80,000 word book or a 200,000 word book, which mine is not, you're only ever working on one small piece of it, like a small little piece of the tapestry. You're so zoomed in. Day to day, I would be working on, the second scene in chapter 2 or, the first paragraph of part 3. And if you just zoom in and try and get that piece of it right, and you're only ever trying to get the piece that you're working on right, you can sort of make a whole book or write a whole book that way. There's another quote, I think it's Primo Levi who said that writing a book is like driving a long distance at night with the headlights on, and you can only see a few meters in front of you, but you can make the whole journey that way. So I guess my advice to my former self or to anyone writing a book is to just zoom in and to sort of block out all the peripheral vision and just work on the little piece that you're working on, because you can if you can sustain that for a year or however long it takes, then suddenly you'll have a whole book.
Yeah, that is a great way to deal with the overwhelmedness of writing a whole book. Also wondering, our other question we asked guests is whether there is a writing practice or habit that's been working for you.
I guess it's quite obvious, but just find the time of day when your brain is clearest. I mean, it's difficult for people with jobs, but try as much as possible to be selfish with that time. Use it for the work that means the most for you, not for your obligations to others. And then, I think we think of historians or sort of nonfiction writers in general as sort of sitting in their dusty studies, just living a life of the mind. But I think that to have a clear mind, you've got to do a few of those sort of wellness things like, exercise and fresh air and not eating food that makes you have to like sleep all afternoon. So I guess while I was writing this book, I would go on long bike rides and be sort of mulling things over in the park. And I think that's all part of it. You don't have to feel that that's an indulgence. I think it's anything that, clears away the brain fog is useful for you.
Great. Thank you so much, Rachel. This has been really delightful.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing, sponsored by the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Florida. Visit our podcast description to find out how to contact us and send us your questions about academic writing and publishing. Follow us on social media at Writing It Pod and subscribe to us so you never miss an episode.